Thank you all for coming. Really feel very privileged to be here with this amazing assembly of people, and I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about coffee. I'm going to try to go through this somewhat quickly so that we have time for dialogue, because I think that's the most interesting thing is to be able to share some ideas. I'd like to hear from you a little bit about what you think about coffee and what you like about it, what you would like to know more about it. I'm going to give you a quick overview, a little bit about how I think about coffee and what relationship I've developed with it over time. Coffee is one of the most important, most misunderstood beverages in the world, and I'll explain a little bit more why I feel that way. Coffee was, at one point in time, a drink of kings and queens, royalty. It was more valuable even than gold. It was so expensive that it was something that was enjoyed only by the privileged few. Over time, it became a commodity that was so common in the world that its value was perceived as being almost nothing. People would give it away for free. It's an incredible juxtaposition when you think about how coffee went from such an exclusive drink to such a common one. It's a beverage and a product that has been instrumental in the building of the economies of entire nations. And even today, a lot of countries depend on coffee for a large percentage of their GDP. Yet, in the countries that consume the most coffee, can you guess which one consumes the most? We do, not per capita, but overall. The majority of people that drink it don't have a very detailed relationship with it. A lot of people drink it for different reasons, sometimes as a drug. Many of us use it for its psychoactive properties and for energy. But for the first time in history, coffee is beginning to enter conversations in the culinary world. It's beginning to stand next to wine and to beer and to food as something that people are thinking about for its taste and not just its activity. In the 80s, I'm sure a lot of you remember all the doctors. Your doctors would probably tell you to cut back on your coffee because it's not very good for you. These days, the latest research is showing that coffee may not only be good for you, but is quite likely one of the most promising health tonics that the world knows of. It's an amazing transition to have gone from something that was considered a terrible thing for your health to something that will probably surpass green tea and acai berries and goji berries as something that people look for as a means of sustaining health. Coffee was vilified early on as a drink of the devil, and later blessed by popes. So it's had a rather tumultuous history. And I'd like to now talk a little bit about what it is that attracts us to coffee. What are the things we think about from a taste perspective when we get excited about it? What causes all this obsession and passion that exists today in the coffee industry? The other thing that's interesting about coffee is that most people that drink coffee aren't really coffee drinkers. They're milk drinkers, flavored milk drinkers. It's the way that we consume coffee traditionally is to put a lot of additives into it, load it up with sugar. And the reason for that is that people have generally not been exposed to good tasting coffee. There's a very small amount of very high quality coffee that's produced in the world each year for a lot of reasons, most of which are economic. But when you ask people what they think about coffee, what kind of taste does coffee have, they might say, it tastes chocolatey, it tastes bitter, and it needs sugar and milk in order to sweeten it and to make it a little bit easier to drink. However, as we'll talk about now, when you have a truly high quality coffee, it's almost like a great single malt scotch, the idea of pouring a little milk into it or dropping some additive into it is sacrilegious, and you wouldn't do it because you'd be missing all of the flavor that's available in the coffee. We can move on from Mr. Hasselhoff. You can hit it again, please. So the reason that coffee quality matters to me, it's something that, you guys all operate restaurants and work in food. Probably many of you buy great coffee and into coffee. Some of you probably buy Lavazza or Starbucks or Bustelo or get coffee from wherever. And a lot of coffee businesses and a lot of restaurants are extremely successful even without quality. So the question is, why should I care about quality? Why should it matter if I'm being successful already without it? In fact, as a coffee roaster, I sometimes ask myself that question because it would be a lot easier for me to make a lot more money if I didn't care about quality and just did a lot of hard work to try to sell mediocre commodity coffee. That's where most of the money is made these days in coffee, is in the commercial sector. Specialty coffee is more than anything a labor of love. Can hit the next. The reasons are many. I mean, as a consumer, a great cup of high quality coffee will give you a taste experience that is memorable, that is worth celebrating. But for the people that produce coffee, the difference between the production of quality and low quality can mean the difference between a life of eternal poverty versus one where there's actually opportunity, where coffee farmers have the opportunity to become small entrepreneurs and actually move beyond being simply harvesters. And coffee delivers a tremendous amount of happiness. And here's the thing about it, is the more time you're willing to spend with it, the more you're willing to sit and contemplate it, the more pleasure it can bring you. Coffee is, compared with wine, they say that wine has somewhere between 150 and 250 chemical compounds that contribute to taste and aroma. With coffee, there are close to 1,000. So in a sense, you could say coffee is 4 times as complex as wine. It's literally the most complex, chemically complex beverage on the planet. So just as a quick background, I'm sure you guys know this already, this is where coffee grows. If you look at these red lines, the 2 tropics of Capricorn and Cancer, all of the world's coffee grows between those lines. Coffee is a tropical plant. It doesn't do well with cold, which is why we don't grow it in the US. Coffee grows in all of these mountainous zones throughout around the world on both sides of the equator. And if you look up here, just below the line next to Sudan, and you see Ethiopia, that's the coffee we were serving out there, and that is the place where coffee began. So it's kind of like Peru with potatoes, or Mexico with cacao. This is where the species originated. And it's still the one place on Earth where there's large, wild, indigenous populations of coffee types. Now, when we talk about coffee flavor and evaluating coffee, the question a lot of customers that come into our stores ask is, well, what should I be looking for? What is quality? Everybody talks about quality in coffee, and every coffee seller will tell you that they have quality. But what are the indicators? How do we measure that? What are the metrics? What does great coffee mean? And what does it taste like? There's, to me, in coffee, and this is probably true with other beverages, but more true with coffee than any of them, is that the pleasure that you get out of coffee, the quality that a coffee has, is defined not just by what's there, but by what's not there. And the reason for that is the majority of the world's coffee is produced as a commodity. It's produced without a lot of attention to detail or care, and it develops all kinds of tastes that are byproducts of poor handling. Molds are a big one, woodiness and the taste of starch. If you push one more. On the positive side, the things that we look for, what is it? If you asked any one of our staff, anybody who's been drinking coffee a long time and has fallen in love with it, what do you like most about coffee? Sweetness. It might seem like a strange thing because a lot of the coffees that you find are just not very sweet, which is why we put stuff in it, is to sweeten it up. But coffee should be sweet. It has a lot of naturally occurring sucrose and other polysaccharides and sugars that can make coffee tremendously sweet if it's a good coffee grown under the right conditions and prepared well. Organic acids, these are the life of coffee. This is what gives coffee its dynamism, its excitement. Complexity, I mentioned earlier, is probably in context of coffee best defined as the degree to which the taste experience was memorable, the degree to which you are inspired by it and would like to drink it again. If you push again, please. But all of these really positive things can be there, and you can still have a poor coffee or a poor experience drinking the coffee, because coffee oftentimes has a lot of undesirable tastes. The foremost among them are things like bitterness, which is often a function of how it was roasted. It can also be a function of the variety that's grown. Some of you might know the two major coffee species that are in commercial production in the world are Arabica and Robusta. Robusta is cheaper to produce. It's mostly produced in Vietnam. It's a large component of much of the commercial sector, but it has a very, very high percentage of chlorogenic acids, which are naturally bitter, and a lower percentage of sugars, which can result in bitterness. Sourness comes from unripe fruit. If you've had any fruit that hasn't yet ripened, it will be sour. Same thing goes with coffee, astringency, starch, and so on. Next, please. This I put here just to show you how we go about evaluating coffee. Every time a coffee comes to us and we're looking at a sample, or as we're working with farms, we put every coffee through a series of tests, almost as though we were physicians and we're diagnosing what's there. And a coffee's overall quality, its final quality as evaluated by us, is really just a sum of all of the things that it's doing right and all of the tastes that we find attractive and desirable, minus anything that it's doing wrong that we wish were not there. And so on the right side we have positive traits, the left side negative ones. So this is a coffee presentation. I'm showing you fruit. Why am I showing you fruit? Well, fruit is probably, I don't know if all of you agree, among the most delicious things that we eat. Fruit has a remarkable sort of life to it that really ignites the senses. And the things that give these fruits their distinct characters are some of the sugars and the organic acids. These same acids are some of the things that give coffee its flavor. So almost any coffee you find will have some citric acid, which is the acid common in citrus fruits like lemons and tangerines. That's why I put this as a citric acid molecule there. The malic and tartaric acids, which you find in things like apples and apricots and peaches, or in berries and grapes, those are less common. And when we talk about complexity in coffee, sometimes this is what we're talking about, is the presence not just of strong citric tastes, but of other organic fruit acid tastes that work with each other, complement each other, and create a lot of nuance and detail. The best coffees that you'll find, you can sit for a long time sipping and trying to conjure descriptors to describe some of the tastes that you find, and find that you're writing down 10 or 12 different fruits. Those are the coffees that really get us excited. Other acids in coffee, chlorogenic acid I mentioned, it's one of the most potent sources of antioxidants and polyphenols that are linked to a lot of the healthful properties in coffee. Phosphoric acid is an acid that's very common in Kenyan coffees. How many of you have tried Kenyan coffees? Most of you. So you probably know that they have, Kenyan coffees are very distinct. They taste, if you taste one, you recognize it. It's much different than a coffee from Costa Rica, for example. And part of that is the phosphoric acid. Kenyan coffees, because of the variety, the genetic variety, and because of the soil the type of soil that has a lot of phosphorus, they develop much more phosphoric acid. Do you know if you walked into the grocery store, what's the most common place that you would find phosphoric acid? Coca-Cola, yeah, and soda. Phosphoric acid is one of the key ingredients in most sodas and gives it its sort of tangy liveliness. We can move on. So most of the people I talk to that have not really developed a relationship with coffee and maybe drink a lot of coffee but don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, and ask them what they like. What do they like about what's a good coffee? And the words that I hear are things like bold, rich, strong. But all of these descriptors, they're really not describing coffee. They really have nothing to do with the flavor detail of coffee, and they're much more related to the way coffee was roasted and the way it's extracted. As roasters and as baristas, we have a very, very specific, very critical role, but very specific role in the creation of beautiful coffees. And our role is to take what's there and showcase it to the best of our abilities. Just like most of you, I think you would agree that the best advantage you can have as a chef is access to the highest quality ingredients you can get. When you have amazing ingredients to work with, it's much easier to create memorable tasting foods. Coffee is the same way. It's really, most of the quality is there in the green unroasted coffee, and it's our job to cook it the right way, in a sense, and serve it the right way, present it in the right way. So these, I just want to walk very fast through some of the mechanisms that influence coffee. I'm going to talk about this first group at the top. These are things that happen on the farm. These are things that, to a large degree, determine the potential quality of any specific coffee. These on the bottom in the second group are things that happen once the coffee's already been harvested and processed and exported to us. That's a topic for a completely different presentation. So we're just going to quickly walk through some of the influences and the impacts, the factors that impact quality at the farm level. Genetics. Genetics is huge. All of us love tomatoes, right? And there are so many different tomatoes. I think 7,000 more different individual cultivars of tomatoes, all of which have their own unique characteristics and flavor traits. Coffee is the same. There are actually many thousands of different varieties. Some people estimate as many as 50,000 individual types of coffee tree. Genetically distinct coffee trees are in existence in the world, most of them in Ethiopia. But genetics are what give coffee, it's the DNA that gives coffee its potential. They define exactly how good a coffee can taste and what sort of attributes it can have. And then the environment and other factors, management factors, determine and decide whether or not the coffee lives up to its true potential and can express all of those traits that are available. So this is just a small selection of some of the different cultivars. Typica and Bourbon are considered kind of two of the parent heirloom cultivars that seeded all of the Americas. We're talking here today about the roots of American food when it comes to American coffee, and I'm talking about America, not the United States, but all of the Americas. Typica and Bourbon were the two parents that were brought over by the French and the Spanish during the colonial period and planted and propagated. Those still exist. There's still a lot of them in production in Central and South America, but many of them have been replaced over time by mutations like Caturra and Catuai, or by hybrids that were specifically bred for different kinds of attributes, mostly productivity and sun tolerance, things like Castillo, Colombia. And then you have the really unique and rare varieties like Geisha, Laurina, Sudan Rumé. These are varieties that have such a distinct character that you put them on the table with 10 other coffees, and you don't even have to drink the coffee to know, okay, that's the Geisha. It stands out just in the aromatics. There's all of these floral, perfumey aromatics. Go to the next slide. The decisions that farmers make about what coffee to plant, unfortunately, are driven not by an interest in taste. They're driven by considerations like productivity, resistance to plagues and disease, tolerance for sun, quickness of growth, things like that, which are basically are driven by economic constraints. Most farmers will choose coffee varieties that will produce as quickly and as reliably as possible. And that's why if you fly from Mexico all the way down to the southern tip of Bolivia, you'll find that there's maybe 10 to 15 cultivars that represent 80% of the production. Whereas you'll go to Ethiopia and find that there are thousands that make up the small production of Ethiopia. If we want, as coffee consumers, to have better tasting coffees, the burden falls on us to create the right incentive for and the right sort of relationships with producers to give them the reason and the incentive and the motivation to plant heirloom varieties that are harder to grow, riskier to grow, more expensive to grow, but that produce something altogether different than what the common hybrids produce. These are some of the environmental variables that impact coffee. Probably the biggest one, and those of you that are into wine, which I assume is probably all of you, know that diurnal temperature range is a really big factor in wine production and grape production. Same with coffee. This is why coffee tends to grow best, or the best quality coffees tend to grow at higher elevations. It's because the range between the nighttime temperature and the daytime temperature affects the metabolism of the trees. And when there's a huge range and it gets really warm in the day and really cool at night, you get better sugar development and more sugar accumulation and storage inside the seed. Because, as I'm sure you all know, coffee is the seed of a fruit, of a cherry. Other things, there's a lot of management variables, nutrition being among the most important, soil maintenance that is critical to the coffee tree having access to the nutrition it needs to invest in its seeds and develop very dense coffee seeds. And then cherry ripeness, which we'll talk about later, is probably the key to all of it working. You can do everything else right, and you screw up on the ripeness part, and it's game over. All of you have had a green banana, and you know the difference between the taste of a green banana and a fully ripe yellow banana. It's night and day. Coffee is very much the same way. If you have coffees that are harvested underripe, they'll be slightly sour, slightly astringent, very few sugars, and not very flavorful. This is an example of a well-shaded farm. This is where coffee loves to grow. This is the environment in which heirloom coffee varieties, it's where they prefer to grow, it's where they thrive. This is how coffee grew in Ethiopia for many, many thousands of years before we started drinking it. And this is how you produce some of the best coffee in the world. This is an example of a modern-day farm in Colombia. As you can see, it looks very different. It's kind of an ecological disaster. They've clear-cut all of the existing forest. This is a production system that's more sort of industrial, where the goal is to produce as much as you can, as cheaply as you can. But it takes a massive toll on the environment. To sustain a farm like this takes a tremendous amount of chemical fertilizer input. It's not a habitat for any kind of wildlife, except for maybe some insects. And it's also not an environment that generally could produce very high quality. Conservationists and environmentalists love coffee when it's done right, because it's a perennial that grows and likes to grow under canopy in biodiverse environments that can provide habitat for a huge number of different types of birds and wildlife. And it acts as a buffer crop in a lot of countries. In El Salvador, for example, it is one of the few things preventing development on the last remaining forested areas. Coffee is sort of the guardian of those forests. If coffee were not there, that land would be appropriated for other uses, which most surely would be less environmentally sustainable. It's a little game of this or that. I put these here. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and rather than try to talk about them, I'll kind of give you a sense. Just looking at that, what would you rather drink? The one on the left or the one on the right? One on the left, probably. This is very hard to do. This is very rare. These are fruits that were collected at the peak of their maturity. This is more common. This is what you would see in most places. This is fruits that are ranging from completely unripe to semi-ripe to ripe to overripe. And this will taste very funky. There'll be a lot of unpleasant taste in a coffee like that, and the sweetness will definitely be much lower than one in that. Which one would you rather drink? Left or right? Left. Yes. I mean, this will taste super funky. This will have a clean taste at the very least. Maybe the coffee still be shitty, but it will, at the very least, be clean. So its shittiness will be on full display. This is very common. This is how much of the world's coffee is processed. This is how it should be processed if you're looking to really showcase all of the intrinsic quality potential in coffee. Some of these are relatively low-cost things to implement, but they do require investment. If any of you have ever had coffee and thought it tasted like piss, there's a reason for that. A lot of the world's coffee is dried on the ground all over Latin America and East Africa and Indonesia. And it's exposed to all kinds of environmental contaminants, whether it's animals, kids playing on it, smoke from cars driving by, cars driving on the coffee. I've seen coffee being dried next to open sewers. It's unbelievable what coffee is exposed to, as if it weren't absorbing all of these things. This is how you want to dry coffee. It's also this method of drying coffee, which is far and away the most common. It overheats the coffee because it's exposed to full sunlight all the time. So the heat, just like it burns our skin, it destroys a lot of the compounds in coffee that contribute to taste. So you want to dry coffee very slowly. Coffee goes through an incredible amount of sorting before it ever gets to us. The best coffees may have as much as 50% of their volume removed before we even import the coffee. You can imagine what that means from an economic perspective, from a financial perspective for farmers, if half of their coffee is taken out, all of the worst parts are taken out. That coffee gets sold domestically, which is sad. The countries that produce all the coffee end up drinking the very worst of what they produce, and anything that has value is exported, which is slowly changing, but is still, you'd think you fly to Colombia, which produces all this coffee, and walk up and stand on a farm, that you'd have access to some really beautiful, nice, fresh coffees, but what you will drink is the thirds and the worst, the stuff that had almost no value and was pulled out and was kept for domestic consumption. Coffees will get sorted mostly by hand, bean by bean, both when they're in parchment state and then again after they've been milled and the parchment's removed and the seed inside is sorted by density, by size, by color. Then it also sometimes undergoes a final hand sort by people, bean by bean. So it's unbelievable when you think about what a pound of coffee has to go through before it gets to us to have the quality that it does. And it's no wonder that coffee of higher quality becomes more expensive because there's so much more labor involved, so many more costs involved in its production. Every incremental increase in coffee quality comes with an associated cost of production. But when coffee's done right, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. You can see here, this kind of illustrates the challenge in harvesting ripe coffee because the cherries don't ripen at the same rate, even on the same branch, on the same tree. So if you want to pick only the ripe ones, you've got to go in there very selectively, pick them cherry by cherry, and go back to the tree maybe 12 or 15 times over the course of a 3-month harvest just to pick the ripest ones. A coffee farm that's producing the really top-level exceptional coffee may employ people for those entire 3 or 4 months to go out and pick a small amount of coffee each day, as opposed to a farm that is sending out a fleet of people to basically pick all of the coffee in 1 or 2 pickings, which means they're taking everything. Can go to the next. This is seasonality is a really important concept in coffee. A lot of consumers think about coffee as if it were a Twinkie, as if you could put it in your cabinet and drink it for 6 months. But coffee's not like that. It's much closer to bread than it is a Twinkie when it comes to how perishable it is. And coffee is an agricultural product. It's harvested at a specific time each year, just like Michigan blueberries have their season. Coffee has its season in each country where it grows. And I would maintain that the freshness of the green coffee, the unroasted coffee, is at least as important as the freshness of the roasted coffee. I'd say it's far more like fruit than it is like breakfast cereal in terms of its lifespan and the amount of time it can maintain its peak quality. So when you think about seasonality, this is kind of a quick chart of this green. You can pay attention to the green lines. In each of these countries, this is when the coffee is harvested. So in the northern hemisphere, from Mexico down to Panama, really to the bottom of Central America, the harvest happens in our winter months, in December, January, February. And those coffees ship to the United States in the spring. So we start getting our coffees from Central America in April, late March, early April, all the way through June. And those coffees are at their peak in the summer months, late spring and early summer. Then by the fall, we're starting to transition already into coffees that were harvested in the southern hemisphere. So you look at places like Peru or Tanzania or Zambia, Rwanda. These are countries that are harvesting in our summer months, June, July, August, and those coffees come and are at their best throughout the fall and winter. So really, if you want to get access to the freshest, best coffee you can use something like this as a guide. I don't ever look to drink Costa Rican coffee in January because it's a year old. Any Costa Rican coffee you'll find in January is a year old. It's last year's coffee. Most roasting companies will sell coffees year-round, but it's kind of a silly thing to do because even if that coffee was great in June, it's not going to be great in January because, like ourselves, time takes its toll. We age. So when coffee is really done well, it's a miraculous thing. It's an amazing thing. It supports the livelihoods of millions of coffee farming families. When everybody does their job right, it produces coffees that really sing in the cup, that are as complex and exciting from a flavor perspective as anything else we consume. And it takes all three. It takes the farmer, it takes the roaster, it takes the barista to realize coffee's true potential. When coffee succeeds, it has economic benefits for many, and it has obvious pleasure benefits for those of us who get to enjoy it. So I thank you very much for having me here, and I hope that you all begin, if you haven't already, a relationship with quality coffee. Thanks. Maybe we have time. I got the sign, but maybe we have time for a couple of questions.
I was wondering when they pick the red beans and the yellow beans, ripe and unripe.
Mm-hmm.
Will the yellow ones, if you set them on the shelf, will they ripen up like some things do?
They would, but they would also begin to decompose internally. There's there's fermentation that's happening, and so they'll develop sort of almost like winey, acetic notes, like vinegar, kind of a vinegar note. And most of the time, there are farmers who will pull the cherries off and then dry them like raisins on the ground, and that produces a particular kind of profile of coffee. That's done very common. It's very often seen in Brazil, and parts of Ethiopia do that, places where there's less access to water. But most coffees they're peeled, so that skin is removed. They're pulled out of the cherry. They're fermented deliberately within maybe 6 hours of picking, so that you don't develop some of those off tastes that can result from the natural enzymatic and bacteria activity in coffee. Other questions?
Geoff, in my mind, you're like the Indiana Jones of the coffee world. You're the guy that was on the ground first.
Although, you know what, be careful with that, because I think when you really take a step back and think about it, Indiana Jones was kind of an asshole. He was out there stealing people's treasures, and
I didn't mean it that way.
I know, I'm just kidding.
Like carrying a weight. Well, what caused you to get on the plane the first time and go in search of great coffee?
Well, it really was the fact that I knew that coffee quality could be better than because I'd seen it, I'd had it a few times. I knew it could be better than what we were able to access here. When I used to buy coffee, when we started in 1995, it was the way you'd buy coffee is you get on the phone with an importer and say, I need a Guatemalan. What do you got? You say, I got these 3 guats. Let me send you a sample. Or maybe just say, this one costs $2.50, this one costs $1.50, this one costs $2. Which one do you want? And you'd buy it without knowing where it came from, under what conditions it was produced. And the number of coffee samples that we'd access would be 10, 20, 30, 40 maybe, if we were really, really active and engaged with all the big commercial importers. But the coffee being produced in Guatemala, there's many, many, many thousands of farms, each of which are producing different things under different conditions. And I realized that the only way we were ever going to have reliable access to the best ingredients would be to go to those farms, meet the farmers, work with them, identify what kinds of things were holding coffee quality back, sort of do the diagnosis on the farm and look at where things could be improved, and then work with those farmers to make it economically possible. A lot of times farmers would like to do something, they do care about the coffee, but they're just not, there's no reward for doing more work on it, or they don't have access to the resources they need to do that initial investment, because you pay for coffee up front and then they don't get paid until the harvest happens 9 months later. So we'd find producers that were situated in the right kind of environments, that had the right sort of set of environmental variables that could potentially produce great coffee, and work with them to figure out the economics of it, make sure they had access to the right information. And basically I was building a supply chain, farm by farm by farm. And now we have close relationships with farmers in 18 different countries. We work with them every year. Some of them we've been working with for over 10 years. And we get these amazing coffees that have been getting better and better each year, because we've formed partnerships with the growers. We've made a commitment to them that we'll share the risk involved in trying to experiment with different varieties and do that kind of stuff. And we'll guarantee that no matter what happens in the futures market, because a lot of coffee is valued according to a commodities market, which has nothing to do with actual cost of production. And that's been the formula, and it's worked. I did it in Guatemala first, and it worked so well. I said, okay, we got to do this in Nicaragua. And over the course of 10 years, we started doing it elsewhere. But it was really, it was a selfish motivation. I wasn't going out to help save the world. I was going out so I could get a better quality coffee, so I could compete with the other people selling coffee in the world. And it just so happened that the act of doing so also had a lot of benefits to producers.
I've had the opportunity to visit a couple roasteries and hear different importers and roasters speak about their process.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's been consistently a part of their message has been that green beans, unroasted beans, in sealed bags. And there's a name for it, but I don't remember it off the top of my head.
Vacuum sealed bags?
Yeah. Sort of are in a stasis. They don't change, and they don't degrade, and they can be stored that way for extended periods of time until roasting, and that's when the coffee really starts sticking.
Well, I would say that's true and not true. Most coffee traditionally was shipped in jute sacks with no protection whatsoever, so it's completely exposed to the environment, to oxygen, and degradation happens very fast. Couple of months, 2 months even, you've already seen a high amount of quality loss. With vacuum sealing and with something called a grain pro bag that was developed by Israelis for the seed industry, for foods and for grains, they has a hermetic sealed layer of gas that's trapped in there as a barrier to prevent elements from the outside, oxygen mostly, from entering. And it does have a preservative effect on coffee. So, if you vacuum seal a bunch of green coffee, it will last longer, have a longer useful life and maintain its quality longer than one that's in jute with no protection. But it's not like a cryogenic time capsule where you can open it up 2 years later and it tastes exactly the same as it did. Nothing like that exists. There's people that freeze coffee. They do flash freezing of green coffee in vacuum, which does work. It can help, but it's expensive, and there's also a lot of questions about how sustainable is that really. Do you really want to have a coffee and sell it 2 years later when there's coffee being produced all the time? So we use Grain Pro, we use vacuum sealing, we do everything we can to try to extend the life of the coffee, useful life of the coffee, but there's always going to be some quality loss. There's never going to be a case where you can open the coffee in whatever conditions a year later and find that it still tastes exactly the same as it did back then. But they do help. Maybe one last question? or everybody's hungry. Well, let's go eat. Thank you for your attention.